Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to look at Richard Nixon's second term and a series of sort of circumstances and incidents and, unforced errors that really led Nixon to become the reviled president that he is today. So here's Nixon resigning in disgrace. So let's tell the story of how that happens. So here's your objectives for today. Take a moment, pause, and take them in, and we'll dive into the crises that brought down Richard Nixon. First crisis that really hampered the Nixon administration is Israel. We haven't really talked about Israel, but hopefully you remember from your world history classes, Israel was created in the aftermath of World War II, at least partially as the culmination of the Zionist movement and from Western European guilt over the whole Holocaust thing. The creation of Israel was immediately controversial because of the displacement of Palestinians, the failure of the two-state plan, and the first Arab-Israeli war. There was then a second Arab-Israeli war that was won pretty quickly by Israel, and Israel significantly increased their size. And what we see here is sometimes called the third Arab-Israeli war or the Yom Kippur War. In this war, Israel faced a coalition of Egypt, Syria, mostly Egypt and Syria. And what we saw was Israel really struggling in the early years of this conflict. The United States had previously backed Israel, and Israel had, because, at least partially because of their own defense spending and sales of weapons from the United States and Western Europe, had been able to fight off the various Arab states that were part of the Arab League, facing off against, this Israeli Jewish state. And in the Yom Kippur War, Israel was pretty stretched. The United States and the Nixon administration agreed to send aid to Israel, at least partially because of our continued support for Israel, partially because, to some degree, it was a geopolitical struggle with our belief that the Soviets were backing, were backing Egypt and Syria. And so the United States provided some airlifts and some aid to Israel during the Yom Kippur War in 73. And as a result of this, the Arab world retaliated. Specifically, Saudi Arabia began an oil embargo of the United States, cutting down significantly the United States' access to oil and leading to a spectacular increase in gas prices. You can see here in 73 this spectacular spike. We're, of course, going to get another spectacular spike in 79, but that's a story for later, or honestly for tomorrow. So the oil crisis is going to have a profound effect on American society because the United States is utterly dependent on oil. It's both really important for manufacturing, but of course, gasoline is also absolutely essential in the daily functioning of the United States, both for consumer and commuter traffic, but also for the shipping of almost all American products, or the vast majority of American products. And so, as a result of this, we saw a spectacular gas shortage, lines of cars around the block. You had quotas on gas and rationing of gas, and American society really faced a crisis from this. It also put incredible pressure on the American auto industry because as gas prices skyrocketed, the American auto industry had previously focused on large, powerful cars and trucks. And with gas prices high, Americans decided to start buying cheaper, more fuel-efficient cars, which were generally produced by foreign manufacturers. And so this led to a spectacular drop in American auto sales and was a huge sort of drag on the American economy. So Nixon had to deal with all of these things. The other thing that Nixon was dealing with in the early 1970s was the rise of deindustrialization. Manufacturing employment had decreased pretty substantially in the United States since 1950. This was not something that happened all at once or for any one reason. It was a conjunction of several different factors, including offshoring and the ability to produce things overseas, increasing automation, and changes in American workforce skills, tastes, preferences, things like that. And so what we started seeing is the shift from a large manufacturing economy that employed huge numbers of people to a smaller manufacturing economy that used much more mechanization and automation to produce stuff, and to some extent a reliance on foreign producers as well. These two factors negatively impacted the lives of a lot of American people because this shift from the manufacturing to a service economy is going to lead to a pretty significant drop in salary, at least for those who do not have college degrees. and it's going to be geographically focused on the Rust Belt, or what becomes known as the Rust Belt. This previous era of industrialization, going all the way back to the Gilded Age, this was sort of the industrial heart of America, the places where Carnegie and Rockefeller set up their massive industrial kingdoms. Now, a lot of these areas are going to start losing jobs, losing manufacturing. We're going to see a switch again to more automation, and we're going to see the opening of more plants overseas where wages are cheaper and environmental and safety regulations are less. And so, all of this is going to lead to problems within these cities, a falling tax base, which leads more people to flee, which leads to, again, the collapse of social services and economic malaise throughout this part of the country. Again, Nixon was not in any way responsible for this, but at the same time, this crisis happened during his presidency, or began to happen during his presidency. And so we're going to see a number of different things from Nixon. One, Nixon's going to take us off the gold standard, allowing the Fed to fluctuate the US currency somewhat more and use monetary policy in order to try to spur on the economy and attempt to combat inflation. So we're going to forever get off the gold standard under Nixon and move to fiat money, which is money that is mostly backed by our faith in the US government. Nixon is also going to try to freeze wages and prices, which is pretty spectacularly unconstitutional. But, again, the elastic clause is the elastic clause, and who's to say what's necessary and proper? And we're going to get a national speed limit of 55 miles per hour, which is exactly as popular as you would think it is. So the Nixon administration is going to respond somewhat aggressively to all these things, but the effect is going to be continued economic malaise because, again, you've got a combination of an oil shock and deindustrialization dragging the U.S. economy down. The other thing that really devastated Richard Nixon was, of course, the Watergate investigation. As we teased last time, a break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters was discovered by a nighttime janitor and led to a much larger investigation. Just as an aside, Watergate is an incredibly complex thing. I'm going to spectacularly oversimplify it, but go take a deep dive into Watergate if you're interested in it. It's utterly fascinating. In an unrelated investigation, Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, quits amongst threats of tax evasion. And over this whole investigation, it turns out that the people who were investigated, who broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters, were associated with the Nixon campaign, the committee to re-elect the president. The investigation also shows that they may have been installing listening devices in the Democratic National Committee headquarters to try to sort of tap in and discover Democratic plans and strategy. And the investigation revealed that Nixon had maybe had secret tape recordings of a bunch of different stuff happening in the White House, which might shed some light on this investigation. So this kicked off a massive, massive fight over these tapes. Nixon, of course, famously publicly said that he is not a crook. But some of these tapes start to show that maybe some shady stuff was going down. And so a special counsel was appointed to investigate this whole thing and to try to get to the bottom of when the president knew, what the president knew, when he knew it, how involved was he with this whole thing, and more importantly, did he break the law in attempting to cover up and protect the Watergate team that broke in. Nixon, as this investigation starts to swirl, decides to end the whole thing. He reveals some of the tapes, but not all of the tapes, and the tapes are missing significant pieces of dialogue that would potentially incriminate the president. I don't want to be too strong on this statement. And so Nixon decides to fire the special counsel, Archibald Cox, and orders the investigation ended. This leads to a collapse of support within the Republican Party, and Republicans decide that it's time to start impeaching Nixon. So, Nixon, with the threat of impeachment and his support amongst the Republicans in Congress totally eroded, resigns from office, becoming the first ever president to resign from office. It's noteworthy that Nixon is not impeached, nor is he removed from office. He resigns, and he never admits wrongdoing. Here's Nixon famously boarding Marine One in disgrace. And the guy who ascends to the presidency, because of course Nixon's vice president has already resigned, is Gerald Ford, the former Speaker of the House, a Republican from Michigan. So Nixon is now on his way out, and Gerald Ford is going to become president. As one of his first actions, Gerald Ford pardons Nixon, partially arguing that he's suffered enough, but I think mostly to spare the country from digging into the depths of what Nixon was involved in and really preventing the prosecution of a former president, which would have been spectacularly politically divisive. Unfortunately, this gives the impression that there was some sort of quid pro quo and that Ford ascended to the presidency as some sort of deal to pardon Nixon. Nixon resigned in exchange for a pardon. And so this is going to fatally undermine Ford's credibility almost immediately into his term. Ford does continue Nixon's policies of detente to some extent. We get the signing of nuclear treaties, the SALT, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaties. SALT is the acronym for this. He's going to continue engagement with China. He's going to keep Kissinger on board, and there's this sense that Ford is mostly a continuation of the Nixon administration. And so, to some extent, Ford represents a continuation of these policies. But Gerald Ford has a number of spectacular unforced errors as well. Most famously, this statement where he seems to not understand the whole Iron Curtain thing. So take a moment, pause, and read. The idea that the commander in chief doesn't understand what the Iron Curtain is very troubling to a lot of Americans. Ford also struggles in dealing with a crisis off the shore in Southeast Asia. Namely, this U.S. freighter is seized by Cambodian rebels and is held hostage. Ford orders a helicopter rescue that crashes, killing all of the U.S. soldiers on board, and this it makes him appear somewhat weak and feckless. And there's a civil war in Angola that the U.S., with a communist north and an ostensibly non-communist south, that Ford chooses not to get involved in, lest it turn into another quagmire like Vietnam. This leads some Republicans like Ronald Reagan to question Ford's fitness for office, and there's a real question as to whether or not Ford is up to the task. We also have a number of very, very, very unfortunate interviews with Gerald Ford, including this one. So take a moment, pause, read. Investigations and revelations about the actions of the CIA also make the government appear super shady and Ford, at best, super out of touch. So that's a mess. Ford also famously falls down the stairs of Air Force One, which, again, happens to the best of us, but also sort of contributes to this sense that Ford is, again, not up to the task and maybe not, capable of being the sort of vital leader that the United States needs at this time. If you haven't watched the photo of Ford falling down, you probably should. South Vietnam falls to North Vietnam. The ceasefire that had been in place since 72 finally ends. We have horrific images of attempting to evacuate U.S. troops and U.S. supporters. And North Vietnam takes over South Vietnam and the country collapses. We have this spectacularly humiliating withdrawal in which we have to throw helicopters off an aircraft carrier to make room for more helicopters and more refugees. And so this really destroys any type of credibility that we might have had that we had won the Vietnam War under Ford, which further undermines Americans' sense of pride and purpose. And Ford might have admitted that the CIA was assassinating foreign leaders. And so all of this helped contribute to this sense that Gerald Ford was not capable of being president and not capable of leading the country through these series of crises. New York City also declares bankruptcy as part of this whole deindustrialization and urban decay. Ford initially refuses to bail out New York City and then eventually capitulates and bails out the city at the last minute. The city, in the end, does avoid bankruptcy, but the potential bankruptcy of our largest and formerly most prosperous city in the 1970s really, again, builds this sense that the United States is truly in crisis. We're directionless, the economy is faltering, our foreign policy is falling apart, and our leadership does not have a clear vision as far as where we go with this. Here's Gerald Ford refusing to bail out New York City. So take a moment, pause, and read. And Gerald Ford becomes the first president to be parodied on this new sketch comedy show, Saturday Night Live. So if you haven't watched Chevy Chase play Gerald Ford, falling down and humiliating himself repeatedly, definitely take a moment and do that. It's absolutely worth your time. So this brings us to the end, to the end of this lesson for today, and brings us right in the midst of our national nightmare. The United States in 1968 really needs a strong leader to step up and provide some sort of vision. And so we'll see to what extent we're able to do that next time, and to what extent we're able to stop this decline for the United States that we've really seen since, honestly, since 1972. Thank you for listening.